There we go. You all set? Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. A big question is, how do you raise children? What is the best way to raise children? And why is it that you can have two children from the same parents, raised exactly the same way, with the same influences, and they will come out completely different? Most religious families, not only religious, but every family has different children. And you find in one particular family, the kids really come out quite different. One of them is more scholarly, one is more vocational, one wants to be a rabbi, and one wants to be a plumber. One of them ends up to be a professor, and another one ends up to be a gangster, God forbid. And you find within families, children who are so different from each other. And there is virtually no family that is immune to this. Virtually every family within the religious community, many of us have children who are not so religious, or not as religious as us, or perhaps not religious at all. And this, of course, causes us to be very concerned about it. What did we do wrong? What's the problem here? Why did this child turn out that way? How can we correct it? How can we bring them back into the fold? And so on and so forth. So in this week's Torah portion, based on a sikha from the Rebbe, we learn about Yitzchak, our forefather, the second forefather after Abraham, who had a wonderful wife, Rivka, who was a tzedekah. She was a holy, pious, righteous person. And Yitzchak and Rivka together were barren for 20 years of marriage. And then, miraculously, they had a child. But they didn't only have one child, they had two. They had twins, Yaakov and Esau. And they were both in the womb together. And the Rebbe points out, he says, our patriarchs and matriarchs were perfectly righteous. In the words of the Tanya, throughout their lives, they sanctified their every limb to serve exclusively as a chariot for the implementation of God's will. Their whole life being, everything was devoted to doing what God wants. Yet, when our matriarch Rivka was pregnant with twins, the Torah says, the children struggled inside of her. They moved around a lot. And Rashi explains, when she passed a Torah study hall of Shem and Aver, one of them started to get very excited. And when she passed by a house of idolatry, she also got very excited inside of her. And she was concerned. She said, oy vey, what do I have over here? I have a child who gets excited to study Torah. And he also gets very excited when there's idolatry nearby. What's going on? What's with me? What's happening with me? And of course, she found out that she has twins. And it was Yaakov who got excited when she passed by the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. And it was Esau who got excited when she passed by a house of Avodah Zarah, of idol worship. And both of them came from the same womb, from the same mother, the same father. How is it possible that they both could be attracted to diametrically opposed things? What is more opposed than Torah study and idolatry? Completely different. Not only that, but our sages tell us that Ma'aseh Avos Siman Labanim, that the deeds and lives of our patriarchs and matriarchs paved the way for us, the Jewish people, to fulfill our destiny as well. So they have an influence, and the stories have an influence on us also. So what was going on with Yaakov and Esau? Well, the two of them were born from a nice Jewish mother and father. And for their early days, where did they study? They studied with Abraham. Their father, their teacher was Abraham. And Abraham taught both Yaakov and Esau. So they had a very good father. Can you imagine studying Torah with Abraham? I mean, I would just imagine just the influence itself of an Abraham would make us all tzaddikim. But it didn't quite work out that way. But actually, one of them turned out to be very good, and one of them, unfortunately, turned out to be not so good. What happened? What caused that to happen? Well, we know that Yitzchak had a favorite son, and Rivka had a favorite son. And perhaps this was the beginning of the problem. Yitzchak liked Esau, and Rivka preferred Yaakov. We can understand why Rivka preferred Yaakov. After all, he was the plum of her eye. He was a holy person. He studied Torah all the time. But why did Yitzchak, the holy Yitzchak, who was called a Ola Tamima, a pure sacrifice when he was sacrificed by Abraham, and his whole life was purity and holiness, why would he be attracted to Esau? Why would he be so interested in Esau more than Yaakov, in fact? So that he told Esau that Esau was going to be the one to get the Bechorah, the birthright, the blessing, when he passed away, and not Yaakov. And he told Esau to go out and to slaughter a venison for him to eat, and then he will give him the blessing. Does this sound like a holy person would do something like that? Does this sound like something that a pious Yitzchak would be interested in? What is going on over here? So the Rebbe points out, he says as follows: Yitzchak and Rivka themselves were perfectly righteous, but because the path to godliness for some of their descendants would involve struggling with temptation. The legacy of Yitzchak and Rivka also included a natural inclination towards sin in order to overcome it. In other words, we all have inside of us a good inclination called the Yetzer Tov and a bad inclination called the Yetzer Hara. Well, the Yetzer Hara is called a bad inclination, but is it indeed bad? The answer is no, it's actually good. What's so good about the Yetzer Hara? What's good is that it gives us free choice. If we didn't have a Yetzer Hara, we only had a Yetzer Tov, we only had a good inclination, there would be no choice in this world. We would all be goody two-shoes, we'd all be angels, we'd all do the right thing all the time. And that's not why we were created for this world. We were created in this world to grow spiritually, ethically, to become better, to become closer to God. And not just because we are born that way, but because we achieve that goal ourselves. God didn't need people. He had angels, and angels have no Yetzer Hara. Angels are only motivated by the good. They're close to God all the time. But God does not prefer the angels. God prefers us. Why? Because we struggle. We struggle inside to do the right thing. And every single day, God gives us challenges and sees how we're going to overcome those challenges. It seems that Esau had his challenges as well as Yaakov. Yaakov met those challenges and overcame them. Esau did not. And perhaps that's why Yitzchak was so drawn to Esau, because he saw the tremendous potential of Esau. And perhaps Esau had a greater potential than Yaakov. We are told that all of us have a good inclination and a bad inclination. And the greater our good inclination is, the greater is our bad inclination. If a person has a tremendous Yetzer Tov, a tremendous good inclination, a person's a tzaddik, a completely righteous person, they have a tremendously evil inclination also. They have the tremendous potential to do evil as well. If they didn't, there would be no free choice. It wouldn't be a fair fight. As Tanya points out, that inside of us we have these two inclinations which are fighting for the small city, which is the body. And each one of them wants to reign over the body and be powerful over it. And the two of them are fighting ferociously for it. And some of us are more successful than others. But this battle that goes on inside of us, back and forth, is really what life is all about. Yitzchak saw the tremendous potential of his son Esau, very likely greater than Yaakov's potential. He was a powerful man. He was the firstborn. He had such incredible abilities, tremendous abilities, but he was not able to conquer his Yetzer Hara. That was the problem. That was the problem. And we all have, or many of us have, children who have these challenges. How should we deal with them? Well, very likely, the first thing we should do is not play favorites. A lot of us, we tend to be drawn to the children who are acting the way we like them to act, who are doing the things we want them to do. We have an idea for their growth, for their future, and we hope that they will follow after our example. The truth is, sometimes our example is not so great. I know a dear friend of mine had his father wanted him to leave yeshiva and to go into business. And my friend didn't want to go into business. He wanted to become a teacher, a Rebbe in a yeshiva, which he ended up doing very successfully and very happily. But his father, who was an observant Jew, a strictly religious Jew, knew how much he struggled to make a living. He was a taxi driver, and it was hard for him to make a living, and he wanted better for his son. And he hoped that his son would turn out better than he turned out, although materially, not spiritually necessarily. So the son said to the father, "Dad, why don't we go see the Rebbe? We'll see the Lubavitch Rebbe, and we'll ask the Rebbe what we should do. Would you agree to that?" The father said, "Yes, I agree to go to the Rebbe, and I will follow whatever the Rebbe says." They went to the Rebbe. This was the 1970s, early 1970s, when it was easier to get in to see the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, "Let the boy stay in yeshiva." The father was not happy about it, but he agreed to it. Reluctantly, he agreed to it. And the boy ended up continuing yeshiva, getting smicha, and he spent the last many years, last 40, 50 years teaching as a very successful elementary school teacher. And he made a good living, he made a fair living, but the father was not particularly happy about it, but nevertheless, it was the right thing to do. So sometimes the fathers and the mothers are not quite happy with the choices our children make, even though they're reasonable choices. Sometimes the father and the mother will be concerned about their child, and they'll take the child to me, and they'll say, "Rabbi, convince them that they should do such and such, or do such and such." And I'll ask the child, what do you want to do? And the child will say, "I want to do such and such." And I'll say, "Well, what's wrong with that? It's an honest, fair profession. It's a good thing to do." "Yeah, but we have greater goals for our child than that. We want our child to be extremely successful, and there's nothing wrong with the choices that your child is making. And these are good choices. There's nothing wrong with them." So the first thing is not to play favorites, to treat all of our children well, not equally because they're all different, but recognize the potential that every child has and who they are, and that each one of them is God's child. That's one thing. And the other thing is, if we're having problems with our children, and this has been said by many people, if we're having problems with our children, we should make sure that we show them love. And if we're having big problems with our children, show them big love, more love than even before. Children want love. They want to be accepted, and they want to be loved by their parents. So we should, if we're having problems with our children, shower them with love. The Rebbe says, until Esau went off on his own path, Esau's attraction to idolatry was simply a natural part of being Yitzchak's child, because Yitzchak had such a strong hold. It was gave him such a strong good inclination that he had such a strong evil inclination. And he was Abraham's disciple after all. So he exemplified the Jew who was born to struggle, as naturally endowed with the strength it takes to win. So in other words, if we see a child that is struggling and is having problems, and they're not reaching what we feel are the really good goals and good values in their life, we should recognize the fact that God gave them the strength to overcome that. They have the power to overcome it. And therefore, we're seeing very often many children from good religious homes that left Yiddishkeit and went out and sowed their wild oats, as they say, did all kinds of things, and then they came back. And they came back more fervent than ever. There's a beautiful story I remember when I was younger, that there was a young girl in Toronto, where I grew up, a young girl, much younger than me, who came from a modern Orthodox family. And she went to a modern day school, a modern Orthodox day school in Toronto. Some of you might remember or know of the school, the Associated Hebrew Schools, one of the largest day schools in the world. And she had lots of friends and she did well. But she used to go out dressed not so modestly. And she would go out with her friends and have a wild time. And it caused her parents some grief. And it was interesting because her mother came from a very prominent old Chabad family, a very highly respected Chabad family, even though they were not Chabadniks themselves. But this is the family she came from. One time, she decided to go to Israel. She wanted to travel to Israel on a trip, not to study, just to have a good time. And she went to Israel, and this was talking about the early 1970s. And her grandfather, the Lubavitch Chassid, lived in Israel. He was an old man by then. And she, of course, wanted to see her grandfather. She hadn't seen him for many, many, many years. And she went to see her grandfather. And her grandfather was very old, and he couldn't see very well, just like Yitzhak. And she dressed the part, she dressed modestly to come to his house. And she approached him. She was nervous approaching him. She was uncomfortable approaching him. He's my holy grandfather. It's a very pious, holy Jew who suffered greatly in Siberian exiles and gulags and held on to his Judaism very strongly and fervently. He was highly respected by the Chabad community all over the world. And she was nervous. She walked and she approached him. And she didn't know quite what to say, what to do. Her grandfather, even though his sight was diminished, saw her from a distance and was expecting her coming. And he said to her, come to me. He mentioned her name. I won't mention her name. Come see me. My beloved granddaughter. I'm so happy to see you. Come, give your Zaidi a kush. Give him a kiss. Come here. Come and sit with me. And she started to warm up and she came over to him and she hugged him gently. He was an old man. And she gave him a kiss on his forehead. And he said to her, my granddaughter, please sit. Sit. She sat. His English was not so good, but she could understand a little bit. And he started to ask her questions about her life. What is she doing with her life? About her grades, her school, her friends. Nothing confrontational. Nothing harsh. Just tell me what you've been doing with yourself since the last time I saw you many, many years earlier. And she warmed up and she talked to him and she told him who she was and what she was doing. And she's thinking about going to college and this and the other. And he just gave her such love and such warmth that they had such a wonderful, wonderful time together. She left him. Later, she went to see him again several times before she left Israel. But that night, she was disturbed. She was very concerned. And she thought to herself, look at my grandfather. He's such a holy Jew, such a pious person. Look at me. What am I doing with myself? Look how I dress. Look at the friends I hang out with. Look what I'm doing with myself. Is this really how a Jewish girl should act? Is this how the granddaughter of my grandfather should act? And she started to totally reevaluate her life. And she completely changed. She became more observant. She went to girls' seminary in Kfar Chabad in Israel. She ended up marrying a rabbi there, and she's been living there ever since with many children today. But just the warmth and the love from her grandfather did everything. We don't need to yell at our children. We don't need to constantly criticize them, berate them for what they're doing that we don't approve of, and all of these things. We don't need to do that. All we need to do is show them love. They know that we don't approve of what they're doing. It doesn't need to be a scholar to figure that out. They know how we feel. We don't need to rub it in. What we do need is to always love them and never give up on them, and just always welcome them. We had a family in our community many years ago who got involved with Chabad. They started attending my Torah classes, and one after the other, they had about 5 kids. Two boys, 3 girls. They started getting involved. First, one daughter, and then a son, and then another son started to get involved. And it was really beautiful. And the parents, they became completely observant. One day, the father came to me and he said, "You know, Rabbi, I have another daughter. She lives in Los Angeles. She is living with a non-Jewish guy who beats her up, who's very mean to her, very cruel to her. And I'm trying to get her out of that relationship and to get her to come home. And I just haven't been able to do it. And I've tried various places and various people to talk to her, but nothing has succeeded, nothing at all. What do you think I should do about it?" So I said to him, "You know what you should do about it? You should do nothing about it. What you should do is, does she come and visit you from time to time?" He said, "Yeah, about every couple of weeks she comes to us." "And she stays over the weekend?" "Yeah." I said, "Well, this is what you do. You have a regular Shabbos meal, just like you always do. And you have beautiful food. And you sing Zemiros at your meal. And words of Torah. And you talk about life and how things are going. And invite her or don't invite her to join you. But eventually she will come around and she will come to your table because she's hungry. And the food the smells taste really good. But don't push her. Don't even mention it to her. Let her come on her own. She'll see. She's not going to stay in her room while you and your children are sitting around the Shabbos table having a nice meal together. Eventually, she's going to want to join you. And let that happen. And indeed, that's what happened. She started to come around on her own. No one tried to force her to do anything, because nobody likes to be forced to do anything. And she started to come around, get involved a little bit, slowly, until one of the brothers got married. The wedding was to be taking place in Mexico City. And the whole family was going to come to this big Orthodox Mexican wedding. Now, you know, Mexican Jewish weddings are very interesting. They start early in the evening and they finish with breakfast the next morning. That's what they do. And they're very lively, tremendous food and tremendous singing and dancing. And the happiness overflows at these weddings. And it's really very beautiful. So I went to that wedding with them. They invited me to come. And the daughter, the oldest daughter, also came. After all, it's her brother was getting married. How could she not come? She left her boyfriend behind and she came. That wedding changed her life. She saw the love and the warmth and the family friendship all around her. And she said, and look at my life. What's happening with me? I want that for my life also. She changed. She started to get involved. She ended up going to yeshiva. And that girl lives now in Jerusalem. She's married to a rabbi who studies in Kollel all day. and she has many children. She lives in an Orthodox neighborhood. And it's hard to believe that she came from so far away. What happened? How did it happen? And the answer is, it just happened because God wanted it to happen. There was no force involved. There was no harsh words or criticism involved. Just setting a good example and just showing love and concern to our children. And really that can do the whole trick to everything. Let's continue and let's learn another sikha from the Rebbe. This sikha was said in 1985. It's volume 1 of Toras Menachem, page 575. And it's based on the verse, Ekev asher shama Avraham mikoli v'yishmar v'shmarti mitzvosai chukosai v'sorasai. Because Avraham heeded my voice and kept my restrictions, my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions. So the Rebbe says, the Talmud states that long before the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, our forefathers observed all of the commandments of the Torah. As it says, he kept my restrictions, my commandments, my statutes, my instructions, even before the Torah was given. This is derived from a verse in Parshas Toldot. It says, we find that our father, this is what the Talmud says, we find that our father Avraham observed the entire Torah before it was given, as it's written, because Avraham heeded my voice and kept my restrictions, my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions. Now, how could Avraham kept the whole Torah before it was given? It wasn't given yet. So how did he know what was in the Torah? And furthermore, contained certain portions of the Torah dealing with the Exodus from Egypt, which took place many, many years later. The Exodus didn't even take place. So what was found in those Torah, in those fill-in boxes that talked about the Exodus from Egypt? Who wrote them? And if someone wrote them, let's say Avraham wrote them, how did he know what was going to happen years from then? So, as it says, the Exodus took place more than 300 years after Avram's passing. Avram's fulfillment of the mitzvah tefillin could not have been identical to ours. They couldn't have been the same parshas with the same writings as our tefillin. Rather, Hasidus explains that our forefathers didn't exactly observe the physical equivalent of our mitzvahs, but the spiritual equivalent of our mitzvahs, namely that they affected in the spiritual realm what we affect to our physical observance of mitzvahs. The forefathers were in tune to godliness and to spirituality. And we know that every mitzvah we do has a strong spiritual component. Tefillin corresponds to tefillin on high. We're told that God himself puts on tefillin. God keeps Pesach. God keeps Shabbos. God rested on the seventh day, so we rest on the seventh day. So there is a spiritual component of every single mitzvah. And every single mitzvah has a correspondingly spiritual source as well in heaven. And that is what our forefathers were in tune with. They were able to connect the spiritual source of mitzvahs. That's not necessarily the physical act of these mitzvahs. The Torah's teachings are not merely documentation of history. They are guides for each and every Jew. What is the Torah really all about? The Torah is not a history book. The Torah is about a life book. The Torah teaches us how to live, how to grow, how to be a better person. So the spiritual dynamics of the mitzvahs that we do helps us in that regard. Accordingly, our forefathers' uniquely spiritual observance of the mitzvahs, that has to provide a lesson for us as well. What were the spiritual components? Now, we know that when we put on tefillin, for example, the important thing is not the boxes, the straps, and the parchments. The important thing is connecting with God through our mind, our thoughts, through our emotions, next to our heart, and through our action, what we do. That is the spiritual component of tefillin. Thinking, meditating, feeling, and acting one with God. That's really the spiritual component, or one of the spiritual components of what tefillin is all about. Now, today, we need the actual physical tefillin in order to accomplish that. But Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were able to do it without those physical things. It's very possible that they did put on tefillin, but the tefillin was certainly not like the tefillin that we have today. They're quite different. So how can we accomplish that? By being the inspiration and encouragement behind other people's mitzvah observance. When we put on tefillin with another person, we are putting on tefillin with that other person. Even though we are not physically putting on the tefillin, they're putting on the tefillin. But we share in the spiritual dimension of that mitzvah. That mitzvah is part of us, part of who we are. If we draw a Jew closer to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism, by inviting them to our home, when there's no virus going on, obviously, when we put a mezuzah on their door, when we encourage them to learn Torah, to come to classes, to come to our Kollel video classes, we ourselves are not necessarily studying Torah, but we are encouraging others to study Torah, and we get the spiritual mitzvah of them also studying Torah. We are related to that. We are connected to that. Just like the story of Yisachar and Zvulun, where we are told, it's later on, we are told that Yisachar was a merchant, and Zvulun, his brother, was a scholar. And Zvulun was sad that he wasn't spending enough time studying Torah. So he went to his brother Yisachar, and he said to him, listen, I'll make you a deal. How about I will support you in your Torah study, and in turn, you will give half of your merit in the world to come to me, in the merit of me supporting you. This is a famous Yisachar Zvulun relationship that exists to this day, when people support the study of Torah scholars, of synagogues, of rabbis, things like that. So Yisachar agreed to that. Perhaps he was a little reluctant, giving up half of his olam haba, half of his divine reward. But he agreed to it. Why did he agree to it? Very likely because he knew he loved his brother, and he wanted his brother to have a merit also, a spiritual merit also. So he agreed to do it for that reason. So what happens is Zvulun is participating in Yisachar's study, even though he's busy out there making money and in business and things like that. But all the time that Yisachar is studying, Zvulun is sharing with him spiritually in his mitzvah. So when we encourage another Jew to do a mitzvah, we are sharing with them in the mitzvah that they are doing. One of the things that really gives me tremendous joy and nachas is when I meet people who became Bali Tshuva through our work here in San Diego at the Chabad Center. And I meet them all the time, wherever they may be. And I see them and I ask them, how are you? What are you doing with yourself? And they say, Rabbi, we are observant. We go to shul, we daven, put on tefillin every day. We have beautiful children who go to day schools. And I'm overjoyed when I hear that, because I am sharing with them their life. I am part of their life. And even though I'm not the one who's paying the tuition, I'm not the one who has to raise those kids, but I am part of that. I share with them in that mitzvah, in those mitzvahs that they do, every single one of those mitzvahs. I am sharing with them the mitzvahs that they are doing. So when we encourage another Jew to daven, to put on tefillin, to eat kosher, to send their child to a Jewish day school, whatever it may be, we are sharing with them that mitzvah also. I know of a rabbi who does Orthodox conversions, and very often he encourages people who converted to get married right away after that. And I'll say to him, Rabbi, it's a little too soon for that, a little too quick. Let them get their feet into it more. Let them feel comfortable in being religious more. Why do you want to get them married off right away? And he feels that it's a way to keep them connected all the time. They won't leave it if they're married, etc. But I think there's another deeper reason why he wants them to get married quickly. And that is a purely selfish reason. He wants to share in that mitzvah. Even though they're the ones who are getting married, but he, being the one who did the conversion, he wants to share in that mitzvah of them raising a family and building a family. And by doing that, by them getting married, he becomes spiritually part of that family, part of that mitzvah. The Rebbe says the spiritual observance of mitzvahs by our forefathers teaches us that besides for observing mitzvahs physically, namely performing mitzvahs ourselves, we must also engage in mitzvahs that we fulfill spiritually. The mitzvah fulfilled by others, by our encouragement. And therefore we share spiritually in those mitzvahs also. And that is perhaps what Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov knew about. When they did mitzvahs themselves, they were sharing in the spiritual dimension of those mitzvahs. We'll learn one more. Let's see. Oh, okay, here's another question. Here's a question. We know that, what did Yitzchak do for a living? What was his job? Well, he was a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he would travel around. He never left the land of Israel. And one of the very odd things that he did was he dug wells. What was that all about? Digging wells. Who cares? We dig wells. Of course, we need water. Wells bring out water, which is very important, especially if you're a shepherd. You need to give water to your sheep. There's no question about it. But what wells did he dig? So the Torah tells us that Abraham, his father, dug wells before him. He also was a shepherd. They were in the same family business. And Abraham dug wells, many wells. But then along came a wicked king by the name of Avimelech, who was the king of the Plishtim, king of the Philistines. And Avimelech covered over those wells. He didn't want Abraham and Yitzchak, for that matter, to gain from the water that was there. Perhaps he wanted to get rid of them. If there's no water, you have to move on. You have to go someplace else. And Avimelech did not want them around. So if there was no water, they would have to leave, go someplace else. So Avimelech was very busy stopping up all the wells that Abraham had previously dug. Along came Yitzchak, and Yitzchak commanded his men to dig up those wells. He knew where those wells were, and they were given names. Abraham gave them names. He knew where they were, and he told his men to dig those wells up again because we need them. We need the water from those wells. And we don't find after that Avimelech, there was another Avimelech, he came along and did it again. We don't find that. Once the wells were uncovered, they stayed uncovered. And many of those wells exist to this day with names like Be'er Sheva or other names dealing with Be'er, and they're around to this day as well. So what is the story all about? What was so big deal about these wells? A couple of wells probably would have been enough, but there were apparently many, many, many. So we know that throughout history, there have been anti-Semites who wanted to cover up the wells of Torah, who wanted to prevent us from observing. There existed for many, many years, from the times of the Philistines, the times of the Canaanites, the Romans, the Greeks, up until the more modern times with the communist regime. They wanted to stop up the wells of Judaism. And in fact, the communists did it very well, especially when it came to synagogues and mikvahs and Jewish schools. They stopped them up very well. They prevented them. In fact, friends of mine went to Russia many years ago during the communist era, and one of their jobs was to inspect mikvahs to see if the mikvahs, the ritual baths, were still kosher, because the Russian authorities, the communists, especially the Jewish section of the Communist Party, made many mikvahs not proper for use by covering them up, by putting cement in them, by closing them up and things like that. So women would go to mikveh and they wouldn't know if it's a kosher mikveh or not. So these people were sent to check the mikvahs to make sure that they were kosher. And indeed, many of them were not, because the Soviet regime knew that by closing up synagogues and schools and mikvahs, they would prevent Jews from observing Judaism. So they worked very, very hard to do that. And in many communities throughout Russia and the Ukraine and the former Soviet Union, the authorities worked very hard to do that. But at the end, they were not successful, because along came Jewish life after the fall of communism. And what did we do? We redug those mikvahs. We redug those wells. We opened those synagogues again. We opened those schools again. We established Jewish communities again. We redug those wells. And those wells now are overflowing as never before. Yesterday, I did a funeral for an elderly man who passed away here in San Diego. He was born in Moldova, and he ended up spending most of his life in Ukraine. But because of anti-Semitism in the Ukraine, eventually he found himself in San Diego, where he lived the rest of his life, very happy. He was very happy here in San Diego. And he raised his children to be Jewish and to be proud to be Jewish. And who would have ever imagined a man living and being born in a situation where Judaism, religion for that matter, is persecuted, should end up rediscovering it again after the fall of communism. So these wells that perhaps it's talking about that Yitzchak redug, these are the wells that Avimelech hoped would remain stopped up and closed up, but he was wrong. Where is Avimelech today? Where are the Plishtim today? The Philistines, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or the Inquisitors, or the ancient Egyptians, or any of these people? Where are they today? And the answer is they don't exist anymore today. These nations are finished. They're ended. And that is the result of all anti-Semites. Anti-Semites don't stay. They don't remain. They don't remain at all, but rather we remain. We are here today, and we testify to the fact that the well springs are still giving over water, the pure water from before, and they're doing it in a more beautiful way than ever. We know that right now in the former Soviet Union, there are hundreds, or if not thousands, of Chabad houses, synagogues, mikvahs, schools all over. The late Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz had an organization in Israel also, in Russia also, where he taught Torah to people who never really learned before. And it was a tremendous thing. Books are being published there. And every day it seems that there's another synagogue opening in some other community. And many of these synagogues, by the way, are old synagogues from before that communism transferred to be a puppet theater or a warehouse or some sort of a physical, some sort of a secular activity. And dafka, you know what dafka means? In your face. The Jewish communities are asking the local authorities to hand over those buildings back to the Jewish community. We don't want to pay for them. They belong to us already. And they're being handed over. And in fact, in most cases, the Russian authorities themselves are paying for their renovations. And then when they are dedicated, the Russian authorities come to the dedications and they share with the Jewish community the joy of the resurgence of Jewish life in Russia. This is the well springs flowing over, the wells being redug again all the time. And that is really the message for us of the wells of the times of Yitzchak. And this should be an important message for all of us today. Judaism is alive and kicking. Not the more liberal types of Judaism, or not the Soviet communist type of Judaism, but traditional, true Torah Judaism is alive and well and growing, and God willing, we will be the generation that will see the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mheira b'yameinu.